Welcome back to Bunny Banter, the first and only podcast for everything Killer Bunnies. This is our second episode. I'm the host Matt, here with co-host Mikey again, and today we have a very special
Hello.
guest, Joe Slack, who's been playing the game for 10 years, and
Hello.
you might recognize his name from the Magic Carrot community, because he's created quite a few custom cards. One of them is actually in the game.
Yeah, yeah, it's the Garden Gnome. I think that it will get an official release in the Fantastic Booster, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it was originally released as a promo in the deluxe
Yeah,
set, right? Yeah, and then it was
yeah,
re-released
yeah, it
in
was.
Fantastic. It's a pretty fancy card. Anyways,
Yeah, yeah.
Mikey, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about passivity meta.
Yay! One of my favorite topics.
Very fancy.
But before we get into that, there is a rule change announcement concerning our previous episode. The rule change was actually made before we made the episode, but we didn't know about it. So previously, the idea of the pawn triplet, three pawns of the same color, existed. However, I've since heard that Jeff has decided with the release of Almond Crisp, pawn triplets would no longer exist. So to create a triplet, you need at least one bunny. It's just some. Let's talk briefly on that. Mikey, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm kind of sad actually. I was kind of excited to take a power trip, and three pawns of the same color, and it kind of I don't know if I like it all that much, honestly, just because you've been playing the game a certain way for so long.
Hmm.
Wait, okay, hold up the phone for a moment. Let me just think here for a second.
If you need time to think, we could go to Joe and see what he thinks.
Well, here's a question. I can't remember. We don't have pawn triplets now, do we?
We do technically. If,
Oh, okay.
for example, if you got so we can get two of the same pawn, obviously. But if you did pawn
Yeah.
cloning
Okay,
after
okay.
that, or random paintball assault could also do it, but that's more
Okay.
difficult. So it did technically
Okay.
exist. It was a rare case, though.
Yeah. Okay. So then I don't know, maybe it's just what I had in my head. Um, but the idea I had this stuck on this idea you could have pawn triplets or four of the same color. And well, you still can have four of the same color, you just
It just won't give
can't
the triplet, yeah.
it's not a triplet anymore. So
Uh,
I don't know. I kind of rambled on for a second there, but
Joe, what are your thoughts on the new ruling?
Honestly, I think it makes a lot of sense. Because you think about it, how it's really not easy to take away pawns from somebody without, trading for it. Unless Almond Crisp is going to add like a ton of cards that let you do that. You could just like monopolize that right at the beginning of the game and then just have a bunny triplet through the whole game. It seems really really powerful. I know one of the things I like about Killer Bunnies is it's really hard to get a permanent advantage. Everything can be taken away. So I don't know. It almost seems to be more consistent with the theme of the game this way too.
Hmm. I definitely agree. One interesting thing I thought of after thinking about the rule change for a while, and directly relates to our topic today, the passivity meta. So the passivity meta is a way of categorizing different strategies. So we'll usually talk about things in terms of aggressive strategies, neutral strategies, and passive strategies. Now we'll get into definitions later in this discussion, but it's possible that now that the pawn triplet doesn't exist, all of a sudden pawns are slightly lower in value, and typically the neutral strategies will focus on more medium value plays. You don't necessarily want to play the pink lethal bunny, for example, is a big target. Maybe you want to play something on the weaker end, like the red gleeful maybe or something. It definitely is situational, but it's definitely something to consider if buying four pawns now, instead of being an aggressive strategy, or probably labeled as aggressive strategy,
hmm
could be a very strong neutral strategy, I would think. Now that it's more of a medium value play. That kind of scares me a little bit, but we'll see as we discuss the passivity meta further. So I have prepared some definitions for the categories for the passivity meta, and it was kind of difficult to make these definitions actually because strategies can be so diverse in how they actually play out. But these definitions I think are broad enough to categorize things the way we would want to. So for each category, we'll have a few questions, and so let's get into the first category here. I want to address aggressive strategies first because I think that's the most common in the community. So with aggressive strategy, the idea is that being a target is not really a concern of yours. So you are striving to gain advantage without actually worrying too much if people are going to attack you because of that advantage. I gave the example before of the pink lethal bunny. People would consider that a high target. So the aggressive strategy will usually focus on playing high value cards, such as the pink lethal bunny, or extra super pink if we want to get really powerful. Offering unbalanced trades, so you'll see players using trades to their advantage rather than making fair trades. And just in general, being ruthless to your opponents. If they beg for mercy, well, too bad for them. So let's get into our questions here. First question, what specific strategies do you see fitting in this category? Go ahead, Mikey.
Well, sometimes I think aggressive players tend to sometimes not have a strategy. It's more just, oh, I have this extremely aggressive card. I'm just going to play it on anybody or the specific person who has what I want or I want to die. Um, it's kind of like I'm thinking of Guy. We have a friend Guy, and he is a definite aggressive player. He doesn't seem to have any strategy except kill all the other people no matter what, which has caused me to target him for the next 7 games. But whatever. That I mean, that's kind of what I see for strategy for an aggressive player. Really, I don't see much of a strategy except kill everybody in sight.
Mm-hmm. What do you have any, Joe, going to you, do you have any specific strategies that you think would fit under this category?
One thing I kind of think of, I know some people just play it where they don't want any bunnies alive other than their own bunnies. I've seen people, my youngest sister does this, where she plays very aggressively, but only towards particular players. And those players
Mm-hmm.
may change throughout the game. So it might be, hey, you two are working together really well, so I'm going to get in there and I'm going to wipe out your bunnies and stop whatever you two are doing together. Whereas then later in the game, her aggression might shift towards someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a
Mhm.
common case. It there's with these different categories, it can definitely be different per group with how we define them. Because, for example, if you're in a group that's primarily passive in their play and don't really, they kind of avoid becoming a target at all costs, pretty much. At that point, the person who's the least passive is probably the aggressive player, even if that player put in another group would be the most passive player. That's
Yeah.
that's something else to consider here is that as we talk about these strategies, this is just what's in our groups pretty much. There's strategies that would classify under these in different groups, and it's a lot of the what the passivity meta is about is being able to classify these strategies and figuring out how to counter your opponent's strategies without being countered yourself. For myself, for as specific strategies, I play aggressive every once in a while, and one strategy that I really like to use is definitely threatening other people if they even think about attacking my bunny. So if they just, I usually do it with Kinder Bunnies especially. It's like, if you attack my Kinder Bunny, you're going to have a bad time. Go ahead and try it. See what happens. That kind of philosophy where people will respect you enough to be afraid to attack you.
Mhm.
Fear tactics are definitely an aggressive strategy in our group.
Well, and I think that's a really valid strategy, especially because, if someone attacks you the first time and you respond by, wiping out all of their bunnies,
Exactly.
everyone else is going to think twice before they, maybe target you.
That's right. I had a recent game with some people on the Discord where one opponent literally ignored my red gleeful bunny when it was clearly the highest value target available. I attacked a completely different player with just their standard, like I think it was like a blue sinister or something, because he was so scared about my retaliation. And I was just left with a red gleeful bunny just generating $3 per turn, and it was just crazy how much you can actually fearmonger.
It is
Brings up,
better to be
yeah, go ahead.
feared than respected.
I suppose, yeah, in some cases, definitely for an aggressive strategy. Mikey had mentioned that it's very common for aggressive players to not have a strategy. And I think that's why it's probably the most common strategy or the most common category, is because you don't need to be an experienced player to use it. You don't necessarily have to understand the social interaction aspects of the game to use an aggressive strategy. You can use an aggressive strategy without knowing much. You know,
Hmm.
you draw weapons, you play them on your opponent. Very simple. Passive strategy, you draw weapons, you play them on yourself for the memes. Not so simple to understand how that works, but I did very well in the game recently by doing that. So we'll get to passive later, though. Uh, that kind of brings up question number two here is how often do your strategies fit under this category? Go ahead, Mikey. How often are you aggressive?
Well, it depends. I mean, when playing with Guy, I'm going to be very aggressive towards him. But when I'm playing a game, normally I tend to be more neutral, leaning aggressive.
Okay.
Um, but I will be outright aggressive if there is a specific person who is gaining either a lot of dollar, has a lot of bunnies, just has a lot of power in general. Um, Specifically, like you remember that game with Hayden that we played where he
Oh
was
yeah.
collecting, all that dollar and stuff, and
Yeah, where
I was like,
yeah, go ahead.
oh,
Okay, I
I
interrupted.
that's okay. Um, you know, I like when something like that's happening, I would like to point out to the whole group that, oh, this person's ahead of everybody. Let's attack him, and then normally that would be the only person that I would play any aggressive cards against. Um, Intentionally being super aggressive to that one person. That's about the limit to my aggressiveness in playing, especially when I'm playing with like younger or not, but newer people. When
Hmm.
I'm teaching people in, I don't want to play aggressive at all. I feel bad, honestly, playing weapons on them. So,
Yeah, how about you, Joe? How often do you play aggressive?
I try to mix it up. Recently, I tend to play with the same people over and over, and most of the time, I don't play very aggressively. But if I consistently do that, well, then they're gonna kind of figure out what I'm planning. So, once in a while, I just gotta jump into a game and just go crazy and attack everything and do what I got to do. But it's not often I play that aggressively. Normally, I do kind of what we were saying before, where make everyone try to make them afraid of me. Unless they gang up on me, in that case, well, then I have nothing.
Yeah, that's about right. I mentioned before that I'll occasionally play aggressive. I tend to play more neutral on average, but I definitely experiment with each category a lot, just for the sake of analysis mostly, and just to switch things up, because it's fun to experiment with other strategies, see what it's like playing with them. Something else to consider is that the viability, we'll get into viability later, but the viability of each strategy might differ depending on who you are. For example, as the owner of the game in our group, I'm definitely a threat as the person who knows all the rules and is familiar with all the cards. So if I go for a passive strategy, I might be targeted anyways, and a passive strategy might not be worth considering.
I know, just kind of a fun anecdote to that. I was talking to Jeff, well, I can't remember his last name, the guy who designed the game, Bellinger.
Yep.
He has that problem kind of whenever he plays with people. Everyone just wants to kill his bunnies because then afterwards they can be like, "Oh, I killed Jeff's bunny." So people tend to kind of do that towards him.
I can imagine, yeah. I bet I would do the same thing. I think
Yeah, I do. I do too.
Mikey and I were talking about the other day. what if Jeff played with our group? And we thought, well, Jeff would surely lose because everyone would target him. uh, kind of
So I
brings
have a
up.
question
Yeah, go ahead.
for Joe. When
Yeah.
you said that sometimes you just will decide to play aggressively in a game. Do you like? Is there a specific time? Or do you just spontaneously do it, or do you have a method to like? I'm going to play aggressive in this game because.
Just whenever I'm bored, I guess. I don't want to say whenever I'm bored.
Okay.
Uh, no, it's pretty spontaneous. Like 9 games out of 10, I'll play exactly the same way. But then at
Mhm.
1 out of 10 time, I'm like, you know what? This game we're gonna play differently. I did have one game once where everybody, it was like a 6 or 7 player passive, and I was so bored. I decided, forget this. I'm just going hog wild here, and livened up the game a little bit.
Mhm.
That only happened once, but
Classic.
yeah.
Yeah. Kind of brings up the point, how often do your opponent's strategies fit under the aggressive category? We kind of already talked about it a little bit, but in your
Mhm.
groups, how many people are aggressive? If you were to give like you could give like a percentage if you want to, but Mikey, you go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. There's probably sometimes there's nobody who's super aggressive, and sometimes most of the time it's just one person who's consistently aggressive. You'll have times where it fluctuates, like when somebody's playing neutral, and then there's a person who's ahead. And I suppose the person who's ahead has the more dollar or anything may not intentionally be playing aggressive, but because they have the most, they are automatically the aggressive player.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, there's always one person at least who's a more aggressive player. When we play in tabletop, there tends to be more, specifically Guy and Tyler,
Yeah.
they seem to play more aggressive. So, um, but I don't know. It's not a very high percentage of people that actually play very aggressively, at least in my circles.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same situation. I play with people on the Discord as well, but
Hmm.
primarily the people at Tabletop Club. I think the way I've been teaching people recently is I teach more of a neutral strategy because I think
Hmm.
it's better to, at least in theory, it should be better to teach people neutral strategies so that they can easily switch to passive or aggressive based on the playstyle they prefer. If you
Yep.
start teaching people at aggressive, which is basically how I learned and how some other people in my early group learned, it's very difficult for them to see after the fact the other strategies. They're kind of like again we talked about how aggressive players sometimes don't have a strategy. So it's very difficult for these players since if they've always been taught that way to see the potential strategies of aggressive, not to mention the other strategies available in the other
Yep.
categories. Joe,
Hmm.
how about you? How many, on average, are your opponents aggressive or not?
It kind of depends on the group, kind of like you guys said. So if I'm playing with the people that, I've been playing with for a long time, there might not be any of us playing aggressive. We're all trying to play the political game a little bit more, be a little bit more tactful, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word. But new players, oh boy, new players always love attacking. So if I've got some new players, they're always the aggressive ones. And once in a while, I'd say maybe on average, one player every game is aggressive. I guess that'd
Hmm.
be a good average. And I was kind of thinking about like how new players tend to be aggressive players, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head saying it's how you teach them the game, right? So someone sits down for the first time, and you're like, okay, this card lets you blow up bunnies. This card lets you starve bunnies to death. This card lets you drop a nuclear warhead on bunnies. You're gonna think, oh, okay, this game's just about playing super aggressive. So I
Exactly,
think
yeah.
maybe that's on us as longtime players to when we're training new players, teach them a little bit more of the strategy and negotiation of the cards.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
definitely agree. When I've been teaching people within the past year, I've the way I've been teaching neutral is in games where I'm teaching, I will overemphasize trading. I'll make a ton of trades myself that would be classified as neutral and sometimes even passive trades, where they're oftentimes directly against myself. I'll say something like, "Oh, if you give me $2, I'll play the flamethrower on my own bunny." And that'll it introduces the concepts of neutral and passive by doing those fair and or generous trades in
Hmm.
excess, more than you usually would. And that will, for new players, they see right away, oh, look, this is a game about social interaction, which ultimately is what it is.
Oh, definitely.
It's definitely a difficult concept to teach though, because in most other games, other than Killer Bunnies, the passive strategy actually strictly doesn't exist. I have yet to find one where it does in its purest form. The neutral strategy often exists, but the aggressive strategy is for sure the most common, gaining advantage as much as you can. While in Killer Bunnies, if you're in a group that's primarily neutral, we'll talk about this more later, it's often the case that the aggressive player will lose most of the time because they'll just be
Hmm.
targeted exclusively. We've talked about targeting specific players. That's usually because those players are labeled as aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe this is a little bit off topic here, but I agree so much with what you said about when you have new players playing, that you want to kind of give them better trades, help them learn to trade. Number one, it teaches them, some of the intricacies of the game. But number two, you're making sure they have fun, right? Because
Hmm.
when you
Exactly,
have a new
yes.
player, the most important thing is that they walk away from the game being like, man, I have no idea what just happened, but man, that was fun.
For sure, yes. Whenever I'm teaching new players, if somebody targets those new players, oh, they're being labeled as aggressive right away. I'm targeting them for the rest of the game. They're not going to have any chance.
It's
It,
hard though when you're playing with all new players, like my family. I taught my family to play,
mhm,
and none of them had played before. And so you have all of these people who aren't really sure how the game is played. And I don't want to target any of them
mhm,
because I get so worried when I'm teaching new people that they're going to not enjoy it because like all their bunnies are dying. Like
exactly.
the first game I played with my dad, I killed one of his bunnies because well, I needed to kill somebody's bunny, and he didn't have a bunny for the rest of the game. So for
Mm,
by the end, I eventually did. I just gave him a bunny. I didn't even trade it. I just gave him one
there
and
you
let it
go.
run through. And at least he had an opportunity to win though, then because he could get a carrot and things. But yeah, it's playing aggressive when you have all of these people who are new. Like it's not a good idea, but sometimes it's hard not to be the aggressive player.
Yeah, because you don't necessarily want to if you're not being aggressive. Like if you're in the case where you're teaching all new players, I would
Hmm.
tend to play passive at that point. But
Yeah,
if you're playing passive and people are trying to copy you, then you're going to end up teaching only passive players. And maybe that's an okay thing.
yeah,
Hate
but if you have all passive, then nobody's gonna like it because
That's
nobody's
also a
doing
true
anything.
statement. So you need to have the hope is that you have some new players that are brave enough to play neutral and or aggressive.
Yeah,
That's pretty much the hope that you have to have if you're teaching a group of new people. I think ideally you would have uh, if you're playing like a four-player game, ideally you'll have two players that are at least somewhat experienced so that they can target each other. And then the
yeah.
new players
Mm,
will see by example of them targeting each other, but them also trading, and then that'll
Hmm.
teach them more of a neutral perspective where they can branch off to aggressive or passive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh, Somewhat brings up the topic for the last question for aggressive here. How viable do you find this category in your games? And just for sake of argument, let's assume strong aggressive players, so they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Mikey, how viable do you think the aggressive strategy is in our group?
Honestly, I don't think it's all that viable. Uh, especially, well, like you said that they know what they're doing, so at least that's something. Um, but still, if there's only like one aggressive player in the game, that person is the target of all of the neutral players for the entire game. And a lot of times when we play, it's like especially with Clarissa, Clarissa wins all the time,
Yep.
and she's the passive player. So I, for the most part, I don't think that the aggressive strategy is all that viable, at least in our circle. And if you have only one aggressive player, if you have multiple, then I think you have a chance. But
Yeah, I think in our at Tabletop Club we do have multiple aggressive players, at least leaning towards aggressive. So
yeah,
maybe I think definitely our group that plays full set, I
hmm
would definitely say it's not viable. Maybe as the owner of the game who knows all the rules, maybe I could pull it off just
well,
because
yeah,
people respect me enough. Even then, I'm kind of scared to play aggressive in that group.
yeah.
But who knows? I don't think I've sufficiently tested that circumstance. But
Well,
certainly
the
in
conch was kind of aggressive.
the conch was definitely an aggressive play. But that was more for demonstration purposes.
Poor
And I
Isaac.
still have slight regrets because I think I kind of ruined the game for Isaac a little bit. But in the tabletop club group, which we play remix there, I think the aggressive strategy is somewhat viable. But that's also a larger group.
Yeah.
Larger groups, you definitely have more variety, so you can. There's definitely more breathing room for strategies.
hmm
Joe, how about your group? Is aggressive viable?
I'd say for the most part, no. I say for the most part because sometimes, or not sometimes, like kind of like you said, if you know what you're doing, it can be. But I'd say the aggressive strategy is the easiest one to pick up, but the most difficult one to master, right? So, no, I'd say in most cases it's not very viable to be very aggressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think we covered aggressive pretty well there. Let's move on to neutral. The definition that I put here, you'll notice some parallels between the format of the definitions here. Neutral is becoming a target as necessary. So you're concerned about becoming a target, but not enough that you're going to specifically avoid it. You're just going to do it whenever you feel it's necessary. You'll usually see neutral players playing more of the medium value cards. Maybe they play a red timid bunny instead of the pink lethal. If they're buying back a bunny and they have a choice between the two, maybe they'll choose the lesser, the more medium value bunnies from the discard pile, for example. Neutral players will usually offer balanced trades, things like a carrot for a bunny, or something objectively balanced, or at least balanced based on relative value at the time. And in general, they're fair towards their opponents, but not necessarily, or on average, being fair towards their opponents. So if they'll target players who are ahead, for example, and that'll help out the players who are at a inconvenience at the time, and they'll kind of even the playing field. They're kind of the ones that balance everything.
hmm
So let's go back to the four questions here. Mikey, what specific strategies do you see fitting this category?
Well, one of the things, like you said, was the fair trading. Like that is definitely something that is a strategy in the neutral category. Um, Whereas, you have aggressive people who, when they're trading, will pick some pretty bad trades for their opponent, or the passive who pick some pretty bad trades for them. Like you said, a carrot for a bunny, or $10 for a carrot or something fairly fair.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, they're generally, unless there's an extremely aggressive player, they will play, like you said, moderate level weapons. No black holes or nuclear wars or anything like that, unless it's needed. Those are basically two general strategies, I think, from the neutral category.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Joe?
When I think of the neutral strategy, I think about asking, how can I make this situation benefit me?
Mm-hmm.
right? I think you have a definition here. Becoming a target is necessary, right? Everything becomes a calculated risk. This guy's attacking this guy. If I get involved, he might not like me, but now he has a carrot. And if I play my prune Danish and I save his bunny, maybe he trade me that carrot, and that benefits me, and that's a risk I'm willing to take. Even though I might tick off this more aggressive player. And I don't know exactly what that would be called, I guess. But I call it the what's in it for me. No matter what happens in this game, how do I get involved in it and how do I turn this around into something that benefits me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, neutral's kind of a broader category in some ways because there's so many different strategies that you could categorize into it. One common strategy that I use for neutral is more the economical neutral strategy, which is things like people will target a pink lethal bunny because it will generate dollar per turn, but they might not target you if you have a Carrot Top Royale saved with green pawns, because they won't be people psychologically will be more so analyzing the bunny circle than your saved specials. So if an aggressive player is out there with his pink lethal bunny, everyone is targeting him. Meanwhile, you can get away with certain things, such as having all these saved specials, and on the last turn, you could play, well, now that we can have 4 green pawns, you could play 5 instances of each Carrot Top Casino, Carrot Top Royale that you have, and that's a lot of dollar generation on the last turn. That's instantaneous, and people won't realize it. The first time whenever I use that strategy against people, first time they lose to it, they're just in shock that I was able to generate so much dollar in one turn. So I think the neutral strategy can definitely categorize a lot of different things. In some ways, you're trying to get away with as much as you can, staying just below you don't want to be the target. You want to stay, maybe you're the second place player, the third place player objectively, but more so than objectively being lower down on the target list. You want to be able to convince people that other people are more targets than you.
Oh, yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
exactly. So if somebody's thinking about playing a weapon and they're looking at your red lethal bunny, they'll be thinking, oh, that's generating them dollar per turn, and you'll just casually point out, well, this person has a rank over there, that's giving them a card per turn. If you don't play it, if you don't even do the math for them because maybe the math is not in your favor. You just directly point out the other threats and kind of ignore your own. It's like in some ways, it can be the hypocritical strategy. You're just pointing out everyone else's faults and not your own. That's one strategy of neutral, but certainly it's what Mikey said as well, where you'll be. I'm trying to figure out the exact words Mikey used. There's several strategies that it can fit under. Like maybe you want to target a person that's ahead as the
Hmm.
neutral player to level out the playing field, but you also don't want to get them too mad about it in case they have a retaliation, because you
Yeah.
definitely don't want to be the target of the aggressive player, because you know the aggressive player won't stop until they find someone else to pick on. While the neutral
That's
player
kind of the
will
guy.
remain fair and say, okay, this person is now behind after I've completely obliterated them. Let's focus on this player instead, but still remain not a target myself.
Mhm.
So, Mikey, how often do your strategies fall under this category?
Most of the time, that's kind of the category I'm in. Like Joe said, you're calculating what can be the best for me in this situation. Also, risking becoming a target. Sometimes even, when you play specific weapons that have, kill adjacent bunnies, I'm willing sometimes to risk my bunny to kill the larger threat. Um, yeah, generally most of the time that's the category that I tend to fit in. Like I said before, though, sometimes if there is a large aggressive opponent, I will switch to a more aggressive strategy. But for the most part, I'm neutral.
How about you, Joe?
I think I want to echo exactly what Mikey said. This is typically the strategy I use, except I think I do maybe a little bit more neutral aggressive,
Hmm.
kind of like we were saying before, using the fear to keep everyone in line. There's always the classic quote unquote accidentally showing everyone the really powerful weapon card you have in your hand, and then just
Classic.
not saying anything.
Hmm.
So that's, I guess I would qualify that as a neutral strategy, probably more neutral aggressive though, and that is something I like doing a lot.
Yeah, we'll get into the hybrid strategies later in the discussion here, but that's fine. I put a poll in the Discord this week, and interestingly enough, the Discord, let's see, let me rephrase this. I'll talk about that one later. One of the first polls I did in the strategy polls for the Discord was on how often you fit under these categories. And neutral was tied with aggressive. Both had 4 people vote that they often play those strategies. So it's definitely a common strategy to be used. Um, I definitely probably fit under the neutral category somewhere. On average, I probably play neutral aggressive. We'll get into the hybrids later. But specifically, I do the economical neutral strategy of having those green pawns and having those saved carrot top casinos, carrot top royales. I definitely like that economical neutral strategy because not many people will target you because of those. And another common neutral strategy I'll use is definitely playing the hero, quote unquote, and targeting the aggressive player, and definitely villainizing people for playing aggressive. You know, getting back at them and being the hero to the passive players, and then no one targets me as a result, even if I'm ahead, because I just did this amazing thing at attacking the aggressive player, when in reality it was probably for my own benefit.
Oh yeah, and I think that's what makes it the neutral strategy, right? You're not doing this to be nice. You're doing this because it benefits number one.
Exactly. At ultimately, the neutral strategy is focused on benefiting yourself and getting away with it in some sense. Let's see. So how often do your opponents play with this strategy, would you say? Or more specifically, how often do you allow them to play with this strategy without declaring them as aggressive? How about you, Mikey?
Well, I suppose, before made that it's more of a specific question, the majority of the people that I play with are neutral. Um, but most of the time, if somebody, I mean, even when I'm just playing with people and maybe somebody has two bunnies that are of the same color or the same kind, I'll automatically point out that, oh, this person's playing aggressive. They have two cards of the same color, one more, and they're gonna have a triplet. Um, so I normally try to call out as much as I can when my opponent is playing even unintentionally aggressive. Um, but for the most part, yeah, everybody I play with, except for I can think of maybe 4 or 5 people who play either aggressive or passive versus neutral.
Yeah, it's a very interesting example that you gave for having 2 bunnies of the same color and declaring that as aggressive. I think that's ultimately what a good neutral player does is even when the threat's not there, pointing out the potential threat that could exist, even if that potential threat is never intended to exist. For example, even Frank, who we play with at Tabletop Club,
Hmm.
he's definitely a passive player, but occasionally he'll have 2 bunnies of the same color. The reason why the neutral strategy doesn't work against him is because everyone knows that he's a passive player and will
Yeah.
definitely not get a triplet, or if he does get a triplet, he definitely won't use it.
Hmm.
But against any other neutral player or any aggressive player, it definitely can work as long as people don't catch on.
Yeah.
As soon as people realize what you're doing and you're overemphasizing all other threats besides your own, then all of a sudden you're the aggressive player, and it's definitely a balancing act with how much do I call people out on,
Yep.
and when do I call them out on it, and how much do I have myself. And
Hmm.
that's why neutral is such a broad category because it's such a complicated strategy to play ultimately. It requires a very high knowledge of the passivity meta and exactly the
Hmm.
pace of the game. Joe, you mentioned that aggressive is the hardest one to play correctly. I somewhat agree with you there in the sense that it's difficult for players to play aggressive in a group that's primarily neutral, which are most groups that I teach these days. I think most groups should be. Uh, but the neutral strategy is definitely a difficult strategy as well, in that you have to have pretty good knowledge of the pace of the game to be able to be aware enough to keep your own threats down and keep other people's threats seemingly high.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with that. And I guess I'm speaking from the context of when I play, at least when I play, nearly everyone's doing a neutral strategy, right?
Hmm.
Some variant of neutral. But yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and certainly such like some aggressive strategies are easier to play than others. Some neutral strategies are relatively easy to play, somewhat. So it's definitely it's difficult to call one of the categories more difficult than the other because they all kind of have their own difficult strategies and they all have their own uh, benefits to doing these strategies in the right scenarios, and it's definitely a complicated analysis. It ultimately comes down to how your group treats different categories of players, or if your group even categorizes players. Maybe everyone's playing aggressive in the uneducated group. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just that an educated aggressive player can do so much more. It's just that aggressive tends to be the uneducated case. Uh,
Yeah, the uneducated, aggressive players are just annoying more than anything.
in some ways, they can be occasionally. Or at least they're unpredictable. You'll make a trade with them, and then all of a sudden they're attacking you. It's like, I just made a nice trade with you. What are you doing, friend? I was just trying to play nice. You really want to do this? And then I'll transition to an aggressive strategy, and all of a sudden be targeting them, and then they'll regret their decisions. Maybe learn next time. I guess in that sense, I force people into the neutral strategy. Otherwise, as a neutral player, it's common to force aggressive players to be neutral. Otherwise, they'll be punished for not doing so. But we'll get more into that later. So, how viable do you find the neutral strategy to be in your games, Joe?
I think it's extremely viable. And kind of like you said, you have to kind of know the rules. You have to know what you're doing. You have to know what everyone else is doing, what they're thinking. But if you can do that, I don't know. I think it's extremely viable because then you can kind of control the flow of the game a little bit better. Um, One of the things that kind of happens in our games, and maybe it happens in yours too, I don't know. But we'll have like 4 or 5 people all playing neutral, and then throughout the game we'll kind of start teaming up a little bit. Like, someone will attack someone else, and I'll jump in and be like, "Hey, I'll protect you. You just remember that you can be my friend later." And then we're kind of working together a little bit. Then other people are working together. I don't know. It almost seems like the neutral strategy almost develops into alliances, and then I don't know. Maybe that doesn't happen in your game. Maybe I'm just rambling off here. But at any rate, yeah, very viable.
Oh yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually something I wanted to bring up is that alliances will be typically, at least in our group, they'll be typically categorized under neutral strategies. I suppose it's possible for an alliance to be aggressive. You could have two players that are ahead team up against one player. Happens with the three players, Jarnak. Had to bring that up for Mikey.
Oh my God.
Jarnak PTSD, but definitely, usually, most of the time, alliances definitely fall under neutral strategies. I think alliances are a very viable neutral strategy as long as they're not broken. Because as
Yeah.
soon as they're
Well, and I think
broken,
that's Oh, I was just say, I think that's where it gets into an aggressive strategy, right? And I've
Exactly.
even, done it where I'm trying to play more aggressive, and I'll say, "Hey, look, yeah, I will make an alliance with you. That's fine. But just so you know, the minute it benefits me to break it, I'm gonna break it
Ex-
because that's what I'm doing."
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Breaking those alliances is definitely an aggressive strategy. I've had I'll occasionally make I really like experimenting with making future trade agreements. Something like saying, well, I'll give you a bunny now if you give me the next $8 you draw. Don't if they don't have the dollar, then just trade for stuff you don't have. Technically speaking, according to the rules, that would be two separate trades, mechanically speaking. So technically, they're only held to that by their word, so they could break that. And I've had players break that, and oh boy, I wouldn't go full aggressive against those players. They're on my list. Those are the
And
players that are go on 2.5 year losing streaks after that.
when we play, if we have someone who does lie about that, something like that, they suddenly become everybody's enemy because nobody wants to trust them for the rest of the game.
Exactly. That's one of those strategies, one of those aggressive strategies that I never consider viable. Perhaps in a fully aggressive group, that strategy could become viable, but as soon as it becomes viable, it no longer exists because then everyone knows about it, is the
Right.
problem. So I never support that strategy. I think it's just as nonsense to go for it. You might win one game with it if you're lucky, and then to do that, you pretty much have to go on the last turn. But I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. Mikey, how viable is neutral in our group, or
Oh,
specifically
I
in the
think
groups
it's
you play in?
uh, I think neutral is probably the most viable option of all of them. I mean, you talk about aggressive, well, you're going to be targeted immediately, and passive, well, you'll be targeted by the aggressive. I suppose arguably passive could be competing there with neutral for what the most viable, just because passive you don't get attacked, but although if you're neutral, then you at least have some defense as well. So yeah, I think pretty much everything else has been said, but I agree. This is probably one of the most viable options that you can have.
Yeah, that's you brought up a very important point there, is that passive, as soon as neutral becomes popular, and we'll be talking about this more later, passive all of a sudden becomes much stronger because uh, the neutral players will, if they're truly being neutral players, they will not target a passive player. So all of a sudden you have a player that has nobody targeting them, and maybe they're not getting as much value as they could be. We'll be talking about passive strategy in just a little bit, but you'd be surprised how valuable it is to not be targeted in the game, even if you're not playing anything yourself.
Hmm.
We'll get into more of that when we're talking about passive strategies here. Uh, so I think that's a good transition. Let's go into the definition for passive strategy. The main thing is avoid becoming a target. And in some sense, the neutral does that as well, but definitely pure passive strategy is completely focused on, at its core, not being the target. So you usually focus on playing low value cards. You'll never see a passive player play something like a red gleeful bunny, for example. That's too high value. It generates dollar per turn. I'm not playing it. You'll see a passive player just play Kinder Bunnies, for example. I love using Kinder Bunnies as an example for passive players because people will psychologically not target Kinder Bunnies because they're so cute. uh,
Maybe there's something wrong with me then, because I have no problem slaughtering Kinder Bunnies.
Oh, I'm targeting you next. If we ever play a game, I'm targeting you. Then how dare you? How dare you? You aggressive player. Any player that targets Kinder Bunnies is aggressive in my book. So low value cards such as Kinder Bunnies, even though Kinder Bunnies are objectively higher value than standard bunnies by a few card relevance, they always offer generous trades. And in general, they're nice to their opponents. You'll see if they have forever water. Oh, somebody needs to be fed. Here, just have some free water. You know, things like that, helping their neighbor in need. So Joe, what specific strategies do you see fitting in this category? Besides the ones
Um,
I
you
mentioned,
know,
of course.
yeah. Well, we're talking a little bit about the neutral player. They're always saying, "What's in it for me?" This is kind of it's similar to that, but it's more of what's in it for you, so you're nice to me, right? So instead of being like, hey, I'm gonna deflect this weapon, but just remember, you owe me. It's, hey, I'm gonna deflect this weapon. Don't worry about it. We're good. We're on good terms now. I think that's the best passive strategy is to not instead of attacking, just try to deflect other people's attacks. The other thing you could do with a passive player, and I don't know if I've ever seen this, but if you have one player that's like super, super aggressive, just be like, hey, listen, man, don't attack me. I will give you all my weapons cards, and I will be your vassal. You will be my overlord, and we'll call that good. I don't know if that could actually happen, but it'd be kind of a fun way to do that.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen it happen a little bit. I think Mikey was on the other end of that, where we had a full set game where Clarissa is one of our notorious passive players. There's a few different passive strategies I'll explain in a bit here, but the one that she uses is she'll pretty much give away just almost everything she has. If
Yeah.
she's about to play Lucky Clovers and she has her own bunny, she won't play it on her own bunny. Even though objectively that will make it less of a target, she'll play it on the opponent's bunny just to get them on really good terms. And we got in a situation in our first full set game with Clarissa where Mikey had Pup-Tastics, I believe it was. And she gave
Hmm.
it a ton of clovers. It got a rank. I think it got some other stuff as well. It got a few centers. It was crazy. It was ridiculous to be able to kill. So in that sense, the passive player helped the aggressive player. Mikey was labeled as aggressive during that game at some point,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden, Mikey would refuse to target Clarissa because at his core, he's more of a neutral player. He's playing more neutral aggressive, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, why target a person if they're just helping you? So it does happen, Joe.
Okay, all right.
It's rare, but it's definitely an interesting strategy to analyze. And she did win that game with
Well, there you go.
how many carrots did
Hmm.
she have? Like 30, because she got all of the.
Yeah, a lot.
We ended the
She got
game.
all Hayden's carrots, didn't
Yeah,
she?
she got Hayden's carrots, and we ended the game early, and she had the most dollars, so we gave her the remaining market carrots. That's kind of
Yep.
the quote unquote house rule that we use that's mechanically consistent with Tivitello's card from Pumpkin Spice if
Yeah.
the game ends early. So Mikey, what specific strategies besides I stole the example from Clarissa. I should have left that for you. But what other strategies do you see for you in this category?
Well, I guess I got a couple things here. Well, and they kind of go together, but up here, living up in the upper Midwest, people are very passive in general, and they don't want to make other people feel bad, uh, at least to their faces. Say bad things about people behind their back. But um, I definitely see that reflected in some of the passive or not, yeah, the passive players that I've seen. Like specifically my mom, the last game that I played, uh, my mom didn't target anyone, and at the end of the game, her hand was literally all weapons, and she didn't lay a single one. And she had mentioned in the game, she said in this game, you can't feel bad if people target you. And I think that going through her head, she didn't want any of us to feel bad that she had laid a weapon on our bunnies and killed it. Um, that was an interesting thing that I hadn't seen before. I had always tried to figure out what was going through Clarissa's mind when she's been playing. Does she feel bad that she's laying it on there, or is she actually have a strategy? And this being only the second time that my mom played, I think she just felt bad
Mm-hmm.
about laying the cards down, and she really didn't have a strategy of not not laying weapons because she hadn't played enough to be able to develop that strategy. So that was really interesting.
How many carrots did she have at the end?
I think she only had one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to Clarissa's example, the second full game, so she's played two full games, full set games. The second one she played, she refused to play a bunny. which was an extreme passive strategy where she went like the first, oh, it was over 20 turns without playing a bunny. And I was thinking, well, maybe she just didn't get one. And
Yep.
then I happened to catch a glimpse of a card she was thinking about trading from her hand to Hayden. I
Mhm.
caught a glimpse of it. It was a triplet bunny. She had a bunny the whole time, and she refused to play a bunny. She would only give her bunnies to other players. I think that's maybe that's getting excessive with the passive strategies, but maybe not. When I was originally studying the game, when I was
Mhm.
first making theories, the passive strategy was kind of the theoretical, but was kind of a joke.
Yep.
Clarissa was the first one in our group that proved the pure passive strategy to be completely viable, scarily so.
Mhm.
To specifically give away cards to your opponent that could benefit yourself. Directly give it away, not even trade. Just give it away.
Yep.
To when a weapon is thinking about being played, to ask the person to play it on you. you know, someone will be thinking about playing a weapon and she'll say, "Pick me, pick me."
She does that.
She does that, and you think, sometimes you pick her, but you really don't want to because she always wants to be picked. It's
I know.
crazy. The other example of a passive player we have is Frank. I think Frank is more of a passive neutral
Mhm.
where he won't specifically give advantage to other players when he can't gain the advantage himself, unless it's a big advantage. For
Yep.
example, if he's playing clovers, he'll play them on himself. If he doesn't have a bunny, though, he'll probably just give away the clovers.
Mhm.
That's pretty standard passive strategies there. He definitely plays more under the passive philosophy of let's not play any big weapons on anyone unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yep.
So that's definitely more passive. It's not pure passive, it's definitely more passive neutral. He'll do things like buying the pink pawn for the memes. He's not actually going to do anything with the pink pawn, he just wants it because it's meme worthy. Because it's so
Yep.
bad, especially in remix. Not that it's actually relevant in full set. But it is slightly, but it's not.
Yep.
Uh, so so he'll do things like that, and because of it, people will go to him for trades, and they'll know
Mhm.
that they'll get a fair trade or a generous trade from him, usually a fair trade. Uh,
Yep.
and everyone will trade with him. Whenever I'm playing neutral strategies, I always ask Frank first because I know that I'll get a trade with him. I have the very common neutral strategy trade of, hey, I would choose a carrot in my top run card, but I don't have a bunny. Oh, trade me a bunny and I'll be able to play the card and I'll give you the carrot. I get a bunny
Mhm.
out of the deal, he gets a carrot out of the deal. Everyone's happy. That trade is probably technically slightly in my favor if the relative value is off, but ignoring that, he'll often do that. It is the correct passive strategy to do that, and it
Mhm.
is crazily viable. But it's crazy. Any other game, the pure passive strategy strictly doesn't exist. I was
Yep.
talking with my friend Luke on diplomacy because he plays that game. If anyone here has ever heard of it,
Oh yeah.
I thought maybe I haven't played much of it, so maybe the passive strategy exists there. I thought, but it really doesn't. The closest thing to it is a passive neutral strategy of slight alliances with other players without any intentions of backstabbing, without any intentions of gaining advantage for self at the moment.
Mhm.
That's the closest thing. Pure passive absolutely does not exist. If Clarissa played diplomacy, she would lose every time. Wouldn't even be close. It's crazy how viable it is in Killer Bunnies. I have yet to find
Mhm.
another game where it's so viable. So, Mikey, how often do your strategies fit under passive?
Probably never. Honestly, I can't. I can't imagine going into a Killer Bunnies game and being passive. I would be so bored.
Yeah, that's a lot of players' philosophy on it. How about you, Joe?
100% agree. I would rather lose than play passive.
Yeah. When I'm playing with just Clarissa and Hayden, it's pretty much a competition of who can be the most passive. And of course, Clarissa always wins that match, but
Mhm.
because he's definitely a neutral player, I would say. When he's playing in that group, he'll definitely play passive neutral. I'll definitely play passive neutral. Uh, just recently, I've experimented with a remix game of playing full passive, where it's difficult for me to play full passive and get away with it because of being the person who owns the game and knows all the rules. However,
Mhm.
it is viable for me to do it under the context of if you give me $2, I'll play this weapon on myself for the memes. And every
Mhm.
single play I make has to be for the memes. Because if I do it under any other context, it's not going to become a passive strategy. And
Yep.
it did work. I don't remember getting targeted once that game. In a
Wow.
three-player game, I was pretty much left out of all the targeting.
Hmm.
Probably because I kept on killing my own bunnies. After all, they can't kill your bunnies if you don't have any bunnies.
True.
So we kind of discussed this already, but so Mikey, we discussed how often Clarissa and Frank have used passive strategies, but Joe, how often in your group does it come up?
I'd say not very often. In fact, probably this is the least common strategy in our group. Um, it's almost like, a brand new player is going to play aggressive every single time. And then after they lose a few times, then they're going to play super passive, like, oh, this doesn't work. And then they almost kind of figure out the balance and start playing neutral. At least it seems like that's how it works. But I don't know that it's very common at all that we have someone who sets out and is like, I am going to be passive this game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on here, how viable do you find this category in your games? Mikey, we'll go with you.
I think for people who can tolerate it, tolerate playing it, it is extremely viable for them. I mean, Clarissa wins almost every time.
Well, yeah,
Um,
yeah, she had the most carrots the two games she played, yeah.
yeah. So if you have the stamina enough to sit there and play passive for the entire game, I think it's a viable option for that person. But for the average person, it's not. It yeah no.
How about you, Joe?
I think it's kind of viable when I've seen it played, and I think it's because of how unique Killer Bunnies is. When every carrot, really, it's just a lottery ticket to try to win. Every carrot gives you a 2% chance or whatever it is. I do not do math. So if you can keep that in mind and just maximize your carrots, I'd say it's viable.
The problem there is maximizing carrots could be classified as economically aggressive in certain groups.
This is true.
So in the
This is
passive
very true.
strategies, often you won't even do that. You'll just have all this useless dollar and hope that sometimes when I'm playing it, because I pretty much have to play it in the context of, oh, I'm memeing, playing the meme strategy, just targeting myself. I pretty much have to hope at that point that my status of not being a target at all will make it so that I can have the most dollar at the end, and hopefully somebody doesn't have any bunnies.
And
In
I
some
suppose that could
sense.
work,
Uh,
be
uh,
passive until the very last round and then wipe out everyone else's bunnies.
I have done that as well. That's more of my passive neutral strategy, where I transition on the very last turn, and that's pretty toxic. That's definitely a toxic strategy
Would
because all
not
of a
do that
sudden,
with new players.
no, definitely not with new players. Oh, that one's way too mean. Just be like, oh, by the way, I calculated that this would be the last turn, and here's my nuclear warhead. Deal with it. Oh, look, I won! Wow! I've done
I
that a few
only ever
times.
played against one person who won the game by holding every single carrot, and I am still awed.
Oh yeah,
Come on.
I've done it a few times, but we usually play with smaller player counts in the times I've done it. I think one or two times I've triggered auto win with all the carrots in a 4+ player game. I think one time I did it with 5 players. That was a toxic win. Goodness. Uh,
Need to go shower after you win.
yeah, you need to go shower after that one. But the players who are more viable for the passive strategy, who are just passive in general as a person, like Clarissa, I think for them it's viable to not necessarily be doing it just for the memes, but to actually have that as your strategy. And people won't target you regardless of how many carrots you have. If I was to attempt to do pure passive and actually got carrots, then it's definitely not going to work. If I'm playing pure passive, I have to be going for the what I call the 1-1-1 challenge, which is to have one with carrot one as your one carrot. So I'm going for the 1 carrot challenge. And I won
One
with it
carrot
last
challenge.
game, so there you go. Tucker wins. Uh, uh, so that kind of brings us to kind of the whole point of the passivity meta is that in theory, yeah, that's huge emphasis on in theory, the categories have a rock, paper, scissors like relationship. That
Mhm.
is, an aggressive player will take advantage of a passive player. Oh, look, you're giving me free stuff. That's nice. That's nice. I'm going to target you anyways. A neutral player will punish the aggressive player because they'll point out that they're a huge target. And a passive player will not be targeted by a neutral player. It's just pretty much how it goes. However, in practice, it becomes very much more complicated because players will be transitioning between strategies. Uh, so let's start with Mikey. How do you see the different strategies interact? So if you have
Well,
some neutral players, some aggressive player, and some passive players, how usually do they interact?
I guess it's pretty much exactly as you laid it out before. Like in tabletop, that's the perfect place where we got aggressive players. We have Frank, who's this passive player, and then there's the rest of us who are neutral. And the aggressive players are normally, well, they're always bombarding everybody, And then the neutral players will go after more the aggressive players, and then the other neutral players when need be. But nobody ever targets Frank because he's the passive player, and Frank doesn't target anybody. So it's pretty much exactly as you laid it out in the explanation there.
Yeah, especially since the aggressive players will often target Frank just randomly. Just like, oh, I haven't targeted you in a while. I don't care
Yeah.
that you don't have anything. I just need to target everyone. Joe, how about you? How do the strategies interact in your group?
Usually it's pretty similar. Usually the neutral players are teaming up and kind of negotiating and fighting against each other's camps sort of. You've got the one aggressive player who's just attacking everybody and can't figure out why he has no bunnies alive because all the neutral players are ganging up on him. And then you have the sneaky passive player who's hoping nobody's counting how many carrots she's piling up there as she's like, oh yeah, I'll be your friend, I'll help you out, and nobody's paying any attention to her.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with what is the majority strategy in your group. And it seems like in our groups the majority is neutral. So
Absolutely.
in some sense, the in those groups the aggressive strategy will very often lose. And you'll see players transition outside of aggressive strategies because they realize, hey, this isn't working. Everyone's targeting me. What's going on? And they'll try to switch to neutral, and maybe it's too late if they've been aggressive too early in the game. Everyone always remembers the first target.
Hmm.
If you play the extra super pink on turn one, guess who's being targeted the rest of the game, regardless of what you have. Pretty much. So in the group that's primarily neutral, I think the passive strategies definitely get away with a lot. I think Mikey and I have seen that more directly with Clarissa's playing, is
Yeah.
that she'll get away with pretty much everything and not be a target to anyone the entire game. Because if anyone dares target her, then the
Hmm.
neutral players will all get really defensive. And I know because I often will do this just to have an excuse to target an aggressive player. And they will all target that player who dared target the passive player. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, in some sense, the meta is always changing.
Yeah.
Where as soon as people start seeing that the passive strategy works, they'll all switch to that strategy. And all of a sudden, now that everyone's passive, the aggressive strategy is the more favorable. So people will start
Mhm.
switching to aggressive, and then once they see aggressive is more favorable, they'll switch to neutral. In some
Yep.
sense, a lot of players though will stay in their familiar strategies. I think a strong player will be able to switch between at least two of them, if not all
Mhm.
three. That's kind of where the hybrid strategies come in, but we'll get more into those later. Uh, Also brings up the topic of how often do you see players transitioning between these strategies in game, not in separate games, but in one game. How often do players switch up their strategies between the categories? Let's start with Joe.
I'm I don't see like straight up passive to neutral to aggressive. I wouldn't say, at least from what I've seen, it happens very much. I definitely see, and I know we're not talking about hybrids yet, but where you might lean from a passive neutral to an aggressive neutral, that I see pretty often, but actual complete changes, not too much.
How about you, Mikey?
For the most part, if I do see a transition, it's going to be between neutral and aggressive. And I very rarely see that though, but I I can't think of any specific times where I've actually seen that occur. But I know that it's a possibility, and I probably have seen it happen, and it hasn't stuck out that much. But I've talked about, myself, and I suppose that's just kind of being part of a neutral player. You know, you'll switch when you being neutral, you're going to attack somebody who's being more aggressive. Well, for all intents and purposes, you've now become an aggressive player um, for at least that turn. So it it doesn't happen very often, but I think that it can happen at times.
Yeah, that's a very good point there. That in some sense, transitions are a core part of the neutral strategy, and we usually don't classify them or clarify them as transitions in themselves because a good neutral player will be able to transition to an aggressive strategy without becoming a target themselves
Hmm.
if they
Yeah.
execute neutral strategies correctly. And when necessary, if they see themselves at risk of becoming a target, they'll transition to more of a neutral passive state
Yep.
where they'll kind of remain hidden in the background where nobody's going to be targeting them for a while. And just because, it goes back to the definition, become a target as necessary. That's a lot of what the transitions go to. It's
Hmm.
it's it's also probably the reason why you don't very often see a transition from passive to aggressive. I've only seen it once, and it was myself doing it. And that was because I was playing passive there with my Kinder Bunnies. No one wanted to target my Kinder Bunnies. And as soon as anybody dared threaten my Kinder Bunnies, it was full aggression from then on. How dare they? So Joe, if you ever play a game with me, now you know. Don't touch my Kinder Bunnies, otherwise you will die.
So I want to play a game with you now, just so you know I can test this out.
There you go. Yeah, don't you dare attack my Kinder Bunny. So the transition between passive and aggressive does exist. It is a very unexplored territory of strategy. Pretty much, I that's the only case I've ever seen it happen is when I just did it myself in a recent game. Because I got
And like I mentioned before, I did that once because I was bored. We had a game
exactly.
where we had like everybody was either passive neutral or passive, and I was like, this is awful. I'm just gonna start killing things.
There you go. Yeah. So that's another case where it existed, but more in a reckless isn't the word I'm looking for, but sort of. More of a reckless state than a vengeful state. It's like, hey, I want to
Exactly.
have some fun. Let's throw some weapons around, see what happens, rather than how dare you target me as the passive player. You're going to die now. I've been saving all these high value cards in my hand. It's time for some punishment. Pretty much is how it goes. But transitions between neutral aggressive neutral and passive neutral are definitely common, but we usually don't classify them as transitions, is because they all still fit within neutral. It's not very
Mhm.
often that you see a pure passive player transition to a neutral state, or a pure aggressive player transition to a neutral state. Well, maybe it's more so the aggressive player,
Mhm.
because after they have been targeted and have been balanced out where they have nothing along with everyone else, then maybe they'll go to a more neutral state in some cases. But
Mhm.
even then, it's more so neutral aggressive because they don't really change their playstyle that much, in my experience. I've definitely been experimenting with more transitions recently, though. I think there's a lot of strategic potential there. We kind of discussed this, but what do you suspect causes players to transition in each case? So, for example, I gave the example of transitioning from passive to straight to aggressive because somebody targeted my Kinder Bunny. Mikey, do you have any examples that you would like to give on what might cause a transition?
Well, like I had said, with the neutral to aggressive, you get somebody who is playing aggressive, somebody who's playing neutral. The neutral player, especially like in a two-player game, um, that neutral person may then end up switching to aggressive because in that two-player game they're gonna die if they don't. So I suppose, you know, when you are under threat, it may encourage you to switch from playing from a neutral state to an aggressive state.
How about you, Joe?
Um, yeah, I think I don't want to just repeat what Mikey said, but I agree with everything he said.
Yeah, pretty much. And then I'll add, I kind of already said it, but transitioning back to neutral or even to passive, I think that ultimately both sides will both transitions happen because of your status as a target. And that's ultimately what comes down to again, where if you're playing aggressive and all of a sudden everyone targets you and you realize you have no chance if this continues, you might transition to a more neutral or even a passive strategy where you're hoping that people kind of forget about you. I've definitely experimented a little bit with more so with the aggressive to passive transition. I've experimented a little bit more with that one. And in a large player count game, if you're playing with 6 players, it's very often the case that people will forget your previous sins of aggressive strategies. And then, yeah, so let's see. Next question here. What scenarios, and this kind of related, what scenarios do you consider the best opportunity for transitions to be viable? Let's look at some specific scenarios. Joe.
So specifically, I'd say if you're being an aggressive player and you've just been knocked down and beat down, it's time to try something else because you failed. Uh, if you're halfway through the game and you have no carrots and no bunnies and you're out of weapons, that is when you need to transition off of aggressive player because you're not doing good. Um, at the same time, maybe if you're playing as a kind of more of a passive player and you see the opportunity, you draw that perfect card to just take over the board, go for it. I guess it just takes knowledge of the game and knowledge of the mechanics and to know when to take that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. How about you, Mikey?
Well, specific examples, that's difficult. Let me think here for a second. I suppose, kind of like Joe was saying when switching from aggressive to a more neutral state. I mean, the same could apply then for switching from a neutral state to a passive state where you just don't have it, you have nothing. And so it almost forces you to become passive uh, because you can't do anything. And then you may find that in that passive state, hey, this is pretty good. Maybe you'll find out that you don't get bored in a passive state. Um, but that's about it. I mean, nothing too fancy, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you both brought up a good point there is that in the definitions there's emphasis on the value of the cards that you play. So a very common complaint I'll hear among aggressive players is, "Oh, I can't draw any more good cards." No, maybe at that point it's important to recognize that you should probably transition from away from an aggressive strategy if you stop drawing the high value cards. Because in some sense, the cards that you have can determine what strategy would be more viable than others in some ways. Any more thoughts on that before we move on to hybrid strategies?
Nope.
I think it's been covered pretty well.
Okay. So finally, let's look at the hybrid strategies that we've mentioned a little bit. We'll often use terms like passive neutral to represent this hybrid between passive and neutral, obviously. Neutral aggressive and aggressive passive, using the term aggressive passive instead of passive aggressive, since passive aggressive, of course, would imply a very specific strategy that probably fits with an aggressive passive, but is not exclusively that. So let's kind of take each of these. We don't need to spend too much time on them because we've already discussed it a bit. But let's start with you, Mikey. What specific strategy do you see fitting under more of a passive neutral category?
Well, I suppose it's kind of like what you talked about earlier with Frank, when he gets, say, a clover or something, instead of being like Clarissa and giving it to somebody, he will put it on his own bunny, or he'll lay down more than one bunny of the same color, not intentionally trying to be aggressive or anything, just because he has a bunny and he can lay it down. Um, I suppose that would fit uh, pretty well under the passive neutral strategy.
How about you, Joe?
I think the passive neutral. Trying to think of the right way to say this. A specific strategy might be like, hey, you don't have a bunny? I'll buy you a bunny, but you got to pay me back later. You're
Hmm.
still being passive and nice, but you're still kind of have that. You still have to have. You still got to come back to help me.
Yeah, you keep it fair, but not you want to be generous, but not too generous is kind of the idea, I think.
Yeah,
Where
exactly.
you're still looking for your own benefit, but not to any point where you would be a potential target. Um, neutral is becoming a target is necessary. The passive neutral philosophy is kind of, is it really necessary to become a target? I don't want to be the person in last place as a passive neutral player, but I definitely don't want to be anywhere close to the person who's ahead. I definitely need to still be able to call them out on it without being the called out as the aggressive player myself, because I can point out to people, hey, I did this, I gave you this, I did all these nice things. You probably shouldn't target me, sort of idea. And
Yeah.
as a result, uh, the passive neutral strategy, people will often trade with. These will be the people that the neutral players will trade with. I found. Because they'll always know that they're getting a fair trade out of the deal, pretty much. Unless the passive neutral player all of a sudden transitions to aggressive and makes a completely unfair trade. They'll most often be offered a fair trade from the passive neutral player. So they'll know that they're getting a fair deal and not going to be cheated in any way or backstabbed or any of that crazy aggressive strategy stuff. I definitely think this strategy going into this next question here, the strategy is probably viable in groups that are primarily neutral. Um, as opposed to going pure passive, because you could call it boring. Some players will enjoy it. I definitely enjoy it for the memes if I'm playing that specific passive strategy. But the passive neutral strategy stays active enough where you're still playing the game. You know, you're still killing bunnies. You're just not really getting involved too much so that people won't target you. You're getting involved. You're
Mhm.
making alliances. You're making trades, but people will more than likely not target you. How about you, Mikey? When do you think it's most viable?
Well, you have to have a bigger group, definitely. But playing passive neutral doesn't work all that well, especially in like a two-player group. Um, Most people, I mean, you either have to play aggressive or neutral in a two-player group. Um, I suppose a two-player group wouldn't be a group anymore. But um, yeah, I think it is definitely viable, but in a larger group where you can be overlooked because there are other players for people to target, but you still have also more neutral options to trade with, like you had said.
Hmm. How about you, Joe?
All I can say is I agree with everything you both said.
Fair point. Yeah, that kind of now I'm thinking about Frank's playstyle. I'm trying to think if he's ever played a game with less than four people. Because I always say the game's best balanced at four or more people. I usually give 4 to 6 as the number, but it can be balanced at higher numbers if you
Yeah.
have experienced players. I'm trying to think of an instance if Frank has played with less than four people. Because that's definitely where the passive neutral thrives, is where there's enough other people that you're never really going to be targeted because you're always going to be more passive than the pure neutral players, which is probably the majority.
Mhm.
Let's move on to neutral aggressive. I think we all kind of identify as neutral aggressive most of the time, and I think that's kind of the what we said. So, what specific strategies do you see fitting under this? Let's start with Joe.
Well, I like the strategy of speak softly and carry a big stick. Uh, I will be nice to you, but if you target me, prepare to be destroyed. Right, and that's kind of what I love to do. I try to hang on to 2 or 3 really good weapon cards just in case someone attacks me. Because once you destroy the first player, no one else wants to attack you, right? Uh, so that's always kind of fun to do, and that's what I love to do. So I'd say that's the biggest strategy that fits in that category.
I definitely agree. How about you, Mikey?
I think that's pretty much sums it up, you know.
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely also to consider. I think the economic strategy of buying the green pawns with the Carrot Top Casino, Carrot Top Royale, that would definitely fit under the neutral aggressive category because it definitely is high value,
Yeah.
but your opponents are not necessarily going to target you because of it, because there's usually a at least seemingly bigger threat. I might be the biggest threat, but psychologically, people don't necessarily consider save specials in their choice of targets. They'll look at
Yeah.
carrot counts, they'll look at dollar count, they'll look at the bunnies in the circle mostly, and all of a sudden you have these carrot top royales, carrot top casinos that are strictly speaking worth dollar and carrots. But people
Mhm.
won't think about them as such. They'll think about them as just save specials. And they won't even necessarily read them if they're unexperienced players. So they might not even know. I think
Yeah.
that's definitely my most common neutral aggressive strategy. Um,
And actually, one thing you said just made me think of this. And this isn't really a viable strategy anymore, but used to be buying all the cabbage or all the water was a
mhm.
very solid neutral aggressive because you weren't directly killing anyone else's bunnies. But at that point, putting down a feed the bunny card was either a beg for mercy from you or a death sentence.
Exactly, yeah. That brings up a point I had forgotten to make earlier that I wanted to make, so I'm glad you brought it up, is a card like Watering Hole that gives you all of the water. That definitely seems like an aggressive strategy, but if you're put in that situation where you have infinite water, you definitely have options within all of the categories. For example, if you're playing passive, you could just generously give it out to people.
Mhm.
Obviously people that are nice back to you. If you're playing a neutral strategy, you'll trade fairly for it. If you're playing aggressive strategy, you just keep it for yourself and watch people suffer. That's pretty much how it goes. But
Yeah,
playing the
absolutely.
watering hole itself is probably classified as aggressive strategy in most groups is the problem. That's pretty much the situation that you brought up. It's just on a more direct level. Watering hole
Yeah.
would be classified as high value in that case. Spending the dollar is definitely a large investment, hence it'd be medium or low value, and that would definitely fit under neutral if we were in that situation.
Yeah, I don't think anyone actually attempts to buy every single card anymore.
Yeah, maybe if they had the red or pink lethal, but with metals, there's the exploit where you can just save the dollar, so they wouldn't anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Finally, the really rare one that I didn't think existed until a few days ago. Aggressive passive. That's a hybrid strategy right there. uh, Maybe I should go first. I kind of already described one. Actually, no, I didn't. I didn't describe it yet. I played two remix games the other day. One of them I played pure passive. The other one I played aggressive passive, and that was I made sure that I never had stuff myself to make me a target, but I would very specifically make people fear me in case they ever did want to target me. So I didn't actually have anything, but I would attack people as if I did. I would threaten people with very large weapons and all of that fun stuff. All the fun stuff of the aggressive strategy, with none of the economical benefits. And that was the game I was going for the 1-1-1 challenge,
They
where
have games about having fun, right?
yeah, exactly. That was the game I was going for the 1-1-1 challenge. I think I misspoke earlier. I said I did in the passive game. This was an aggressive passive game where I decided that I was only going to take Tucker. And all my other choose a carrot cards, I either sold off the carrots or if I couldn't get a good enough price, I would just discard the choose a carrot card of all
Oh,
things.
oh,
That's
oh!
next.
That physically
That,
hurts.
I know. That's why it's aggressive passive. Is it's putting me in a poor economical situation, but it's classified as aggressive because it's a delay of game. It's absolutely toxic. And
Oh my goodness.
so by the end of the game, people would not target me because they were so afraid. I definitely want to do more experimenting with this strategy because it was actually pretty fun to play. It was so toxic. uh, People would not target me. I didn't have any carrots. So what I would do is it was a three-player game. People would be afraid of me, so I would target one player and say, if you don't give me $3, I'm going to play this right here. Otherwise, I'll play it over there. And every time they would give me the dollar because they were so afraid that I would continue targeting them. And then afterwards, I had all this dollar, but nothing to do with it because I had clarified that I was going for the 1-1-1 charge. I only want Tucker. I was specifically discounting choose carrots. And on the last turn, I had exactly $40, and I bought 4 carrots on the very last turn. And Tucker was the winner, so the 1-1-1 challenge was completed.
Wow.
It was amazing. I'm so excited to do more testing with the aggressive passive strategy, but oh boy, it's toxic. Nobody wants to target you. You don't want to actually gain any advantage. You just want to make people suffer.
Sadistic, what
That's
it is.
it's so sadistic. It's basically the psychopath strategy. You're gonna make everyone suffer without actually gaining any advantage. It's so terrible. I suppose you could classify under these strategies. You could put playing ranged weapons when you're losing more binds out of the deal than your opponents. That would be an aggressive passive strategy, I guess. But I
Hmm.
think it's so much more than that. And there's so much unexplored territory. So I'm pretty excited. Mikey, do you have obviously you haven't directly experienced aggressive passive, but do you have any potential theories on the idea?
I had one, and I honestly, I can't remember what it was anymore. Your story was so fascinating that it just evaporated from my mind.
Okay, how about we come back to you in a second? Joe, any
Sure.
potential theories?
My only theory is that if we're talking about being passive aggressive, probably the expert on that would have to be my ex girlfriend.
Oh.
And yes, I waited this entire podcast to make that joke.
Well done. Yeah, being passive aggressive also fits under this strategy, somewhat. I don't know, ironically, but it's kind of funny that it does. But yeah, it's so much more than being a passive aggressive, though. So that's why I call it aggressive passive. Mikey, did you think of your thought?
No, it's gone.
Oh, sad day. Okay,
Yeah.
so that was the end of our question. Do we have any closing thoughts, Joe? Closing thoughts on the passivity meta?
Um, I honestly, I think it's a great way to categorize the game. When you and I talked about this originally, I kind of had always thought of the game this way, but never really verbalized it like you did. So thank you for coming up with this idea. I think it fits the game excellently.
Yeah, and in our group, it's definitely I came up with it within the past year, and our games with our group at Tabletop Club definitely helped out in doing so. The definitions were officially written just this past week, although I more or less had the ideas. It's easy enough to categorize strategies in the moment, but it's hard to write a broad definition. So I'm glad that through this podcast I was able to narrow down those definitions. Mikey, how about any closing thoughts on the passivity meta?
I just think this was really interesting because I mean I've heard you talk about this so many times and I've understood, well, Guy's aggressive, Clarissa is passive, I tend to play neutral, but never have I thought about it so much where there's a lot of strategy to it other than just that's just the way that people play. So that was really interesting to dig down deep and to actually see the strategy that could be behind each person's reason for playing with that meta.
Yeah, ultimately, I think pretty much all Killer Bunny strategies can be categorized in this way. So in some sense, all strategy is rooted in the passivity meta, whether players know it or not. It's just a way of clarifying the strategies that have already existed all this time.
Hmm.
And potentially finding new ones. As I was writing this series of questions, I was thinking, we were the terms we had were passive, neutral, neutral, aggressive for the hybrids. I thought, okay, I thought to myself, what if there's an aggressive passive strategy? And then I tried it, and it's like, hey, this actually works. You would never think. A few days ago, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to have to clarify that aggressive passive probably doesn't exist. But then I thought to myself, maybe it does. Let's try it. And it worked. It's terrifying how well it worked. I'm definitely going to experiment with it a whole lot more because of this funny Banter episode. And I hope everyone listening will experiment with other strategies as well, because it sure is fun to experiment with these strategies. Figuring out how other people play, finding new ways to play yourself, and you'll get surprised with how viable some strategies can be. It's so counterintuitive that the passive strategy can win. Example I forgot to bring up was the passive strategy. It was in our full set game, Mikey. The passive
Hmm.
strategy of reminding Hayden to buy the medals. And
Oh
all of a
yeah.
sudden, at the end of the game, he had the most dollar because I reminded him to buy the medals. I reminded him to sell the medals. He gained like $50 because of me. It was only because of me that he had an extra $50 with
Yep.
no benefit to myself, except maybe he targeted me less. It's hard to say. And all of a sudden, at the end of the game, everyone exclusively targeted him, and he was left without a
Yep.
bunny because I had been nice to him. It's crazy. There's a common term in gaming known as king making, and that's helping an opponent to get ahead. And risk if you just sacrifice all of your land to one opponent so that they'll be able to clobber everyone else. King
Yep.
making in Killer Bunnies only hurts the opponent you help. and that's amazing. In any
I
other
suppose
game, it would become imbalanced.
that would be
Well,
classified then as aggressive passive, I'm sure.
It could, if you're king making for the sake of them dying, perhaps. That
Yeah.
could be. It definitely could be. I'll have to experiment with that further. There's different ways you could classify it, of course.
Hmm.
Um, if you're, I think it might be a part of passive neutral, but it's definitely a weird branch of passive neutral where you're giving the players advantage, but then you're also calling them out on that advantage. I'm not sure how viable that would be to specifically call them out. So maybe aggressive passive,
I
Hmm.
could see
because the.
like oh, sorry, didn't
Go
mean to
ahead.
interrupt you. I was gonna say I could see like drawing a high ranking card and then putting it on an opponent's bunny to be like, look, he's got a rank now. You should kill him.
Yeah, but the problem with that strategy, I would expect. I haven't actually tested it. It could work. The problem I expect is if you give a rank to someone and then you tell people to target that person because you gave them the rank, all of a sudden you have gotten in the situation where, typically the passive strategy will gain the advantage of the person you help will not target you. As soon as you suggest to target the person because you helped them, then that person will again target you.
Yeah, I
I
suppose.
I would expect. You have to hope that there's enough neutral players that it looks like you're just being nice and you never reveal your actual intentions. But in reality, you're hoping that everyone will call out this player and just ruin their day. And it could be completely unintentional as well while playing passive to ruin someone's day. I definitely didn't intend Hayden to not have a bunny in the end when I was reminding him of medals. I was just hoping I wouldn't be targeted. So yes, there's definitely a lot more to explore with the passivity meta. I think the community would benefit a lot from further exploring it. Lots of trading strategies, lots of unexplored strategies. I just discovered aggressive passive. Maybe someone else had already discovered it before me, but we'll see.
Could be.
If you have, leave something in the comments. I'll be interested to find that out. Uh, so with that, I think that will end our second episode of Bunny Banter.
All
Uh,
right.
Mikey, what do you have to say to the community as we end?
Jeff bless.
Jeff, bless.
F bless.